Shall we start now?
Welcome to University Baptist Church's Bible study this morning. We're continuing this series of studies on biblical response to a time of crisis. And today we're looking at responses to the crucifixion. We're looking at the way Jesus' earliest followers reacted right after the crucifixion. And we're going to talk about our reaction to it. So as you're joining us, we'd like to welcome you and say how happy we are to have you here this morning and look forward to a fruitful conversation. This is something that we're trying a little bit new. We're in a conversational format here where Will and I can both talk to you. We're trying to maintain our safe social distance so that we can try to help flatten the curve, do everything that we can do to help flatten that curve. So, Will, do you want to welcome everybody?
Yeah, so it is great to see you all, and I see many folks saying hello on the comments. So if you are watching on YouTube or Facebook, we're going to be monitoring those comments as we go along. So I'll have YouTube pulled up here, and I believe Matt's going to have Facebook pulled up there.
Yep.
And so we can see everyone here and have a good conversation. So we thought it would be nice to have both of us here to be able to talk to each other, so it's not just one person talking, and so that we can incorporate your comments throughout. So I already see good mornings from the Goffs and from Shirley Clark, Pam Beasley, Martha Ballinger, Donna Ballard, Jeanette May, Jackie Lockwood, Elizabeth Mulcahy, and they keep popping in there. So please do find out where that comment area is and start typing and say hello. And it's wonderful to see each other and to be able to share this Easter celebration together, because this is a joyful Sunday morning, Easter Sunday. Even though it's a little different and we have to be apart from one another, it is still good to be together in this way. Let's see, I see Marcus Stanley and Jack Averill, and Joanne too, I bet. So good morning to all of you.
I'm still trying to work out where to see the comments on this.
Yeah, sometimes the Facebook takes a little bit longer to get going. The YouTube pops up right away, so we're still getting that there. But it is good to be together. As Matt said, we've been doing this for a few weeks, and we've been talking about different biblical responses to crisis. And so we were thinking about what to do for Easter Sunday, and kind of said, you know what? For those early followers of Jesus, for his disciples, and not just the 12, but all of those who were following him and learning from him, what bigger crisis could there have been than Good Friday, than all that happened during Holy Week, as Christ seemed on Palm Sunday that he was going to be this glorious king, and then everything turned upside down and Jesus was killed. And so you can imagine this crisis for them, each of them, for their own faith, for their understanding of God, and for what they were going to do in their lives. And so we thought it would be interesting to look at these responses to crisis that we see in those disciples.
So one of the things that we found when we were looking at putting this together is a lot of the post-crucifixion responses come from John. So this is a John-heavy conversation. And that brings up one of the distinctions between John and the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptics are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Mark being the first of the four Gospels. Matthew and Luke both had access to Mark in some form, then they both also had access to another source that scholars call Q, and those are primarily sayings of Jesus. John came in sort of a different stream. The way scholars refer to John is it came out of the Johannine community. And with John, there's a different emphasis than the other Gospels. All four tell us something about the nature of God, and all four help us understand who God is for us. So all four are necessary and helpful. And so when we bring up distinctions between them, we're not prioritizing one over the other. And one place I want to highlight as we get into some of these biblical responses in John is the way that John looked at the crucifixion. This was an outpouring of Jesus' self. He was giving himself over. There was a fair amount of intentionality in John. And I'm using here Raymond Brown's The Community of the Beloved disciple. This is a fantastic book for understanding the Gospel of John. It really takes a narrative approach and looks at the way the entire Gospel sort of formed out of this community. In John, the Passion, this Holy Week that we've been taking all these stops along this journey to today, takes a different shape in John. And one of the things that I want to bring up is the distinction between John's Jesus, who is no victim. I mean, he is giving himself over, and just for to contrast that with Mark's Jesus, where we have in Mark 15:34, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's a different approach. Mark, I like to think of as giving us the humanity of Christ. We get a much more sense, an earthy feel of who Jesus could have been as a person. John, we get more of this logos, the Word made flesh, this connection between the divinity and the humanity of God. And so in our exploration, in the handout, if you've had a chance to look at it, we start with Peter's denial in John 18. And at this point, Will or I would normally ask somebody if they could read it. So I'd like to invite you to read along with me on your screen as we look at these verses 25 through 27. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and they asked him, "You're not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I'm not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, the cock crowed. When we think about the crucifixion and we try to go back to the events of Holy Week, we've been tracing this all week. This seems like a natural response because it went from the triumph of Palm Sunday, coming into Jerusalem with great expectations. Then we have in Matthew and in Luke a number of parables, and Jesus is teaching, he's cleansing the temple, he's in conflict with the priests. And then we get to what we've been celebrating here as Spy Wednesday, or remembering, celebrate's the wrong word. But when Judas made the deal to betray Christ. And so that you get this flow of the week. And still, it may not have set in with the rest of the disciples, because obviously this deal with the Pharisees would have been made in secret. But then you get to Maundy Thursday, when Jesus gives his commandment to love one another, washes his disciples' feet, and also institutes what we celebrate as the Lord's Supper. At that point, it still hasn't fallen apart, but then things start moving in high speed, in fast motion, because Jesus, they arrest him, they have a mock trial, they beat him, and now we get to the crucifixion. And so Peter's anxiety would have just shot through the roof. And maybe in some ways we can use the world around us as a reminder of what anxiety feels like, and can start to identify a little bit with Peter. Weren't you there? Now he's just seen what happened. And so that response to the arrest would have been, I think, natural.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting how it's framed here in John's Gospel as Peter is denying Christ. It isn't just, do you know him? Do you know Jesus? But the question is, are you one of his disciples? And so the question really is, who are you, Peter? And so Peter's response in denying Christ, he's also denying who he is as a disciple. Mm-hmm. So it's, are you a disciple? I am not, which is a pretty striking phrase to say, I am not a disciple.
It's a strong phrase.
It is, and it's not just about Jesus; it's about Peter.
Right.
And I think that's something about what happens in a crisis is that we learn about who we are and are faced with questions about what kind of person am I? What am I going to choose to be in this moment?
But and I making it personal to me sounds a little bit like the way some people have responded to the pandemic. Early on, especially, people were hoarding toilet paper. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I know that seems like cartoonish, but it's like, what can I do? I can go buy something that's not going to go bad. I can do something.
Yeah, there is kind of an initial kind of jerk response to something, to just kind of immediately do something. And then in time now, I think we're starting to see more people asking kind of deeper, thoughtful questions that get to, okay, well, now that everything is turned upside down and society is not going to be the same that it was before, what's it going to be now? What's going to take how is it going to be different? How am I going to be different? And to make that personal as well, what kind of person am I going to be coming out of this?
And if Peter had had the opportunity to sort of take that 10,000-foot approach and could have looked at the scene from maybe a wider angle and thought, wait a second, the kind of disciple I am, the kind of person I am, is not one who denies Jesus. If we look back just a page in my Bible, we'd see Peter assuring Jesus, I would never deny you. I would die first. Well, fear comes in and that gut reaction comes out. But given the opportunity and some time, and what tradition tells us is that when Peter was going to be put to death, he elected to be crucified upside down because he said, I'm not worthy to be killed in the same manner as my Lord.
Yeah, and there is something about a crisis that reveals to us who we are and reveals our misconceptions, just as Peter thought, no, I would never deny you.
Right.
And I've heard people, in a joking way about the pandemic stuff saying, well, I'd always thought if I had more time, my house would be clean and I would cook more and I would exercise and I would learn Spanish and I would do all these things. And now that I've had all this time and did not do that, I guess that wasn't the reason. That it's sort of a light way to look at it. But there are ways that, it's easy to tell ourselves certain things. And then when we find ourselves tested on a deeper level, we sort of learn, okay, what kind of person am I when faced with a real crisis?
And the question, the takeaway maybe for us is sort of answering that who am I question. If we're to look at a biblical response to crisis, and now we're juxtaposing that with Peter responding to the crucifixion, we can now ask ourselves, who am I? What does it mean for me? Do I want to be the kind of person who cleans my house? I mean, nobody's going to say no to that, but it's like, maybe on a spiritual level, am I the kind of person who is going to carve out time to develop a stronger faith journey so that in the time of crisis, I can respond to the fruits of the Spirit?
Absolutely.
Do you want to look at...
So let's go on to the next one here, because I think Peter's denial is certainly understandable, and we hear we can see the fear in him, and as he's afraid for himself and makes a decision in fear, and I think that's completely understandable. I think it's interesting as we skip a couple chapters ahead to chapter 20, we get to 20:19, we've got all the disciples there again meeting, and again, we see fear overwhelming. And so let's read John 20:19 to 23, and I'll read it for you. Read along with us if you'd like. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And after he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." And so I think this one flows pretty smoothly out of the last one when we have Peter denying Christ and denying himself out of fear. Now we have the disciples all huddled together and sharing in their fear together. And again, can't blame them at all because they have just seen Jesus killed, and it's a very real possibility that they will be as well. And they're just trying to make sense of this. And so that is one of those initial responses they have, is to get together. And we see them getting together and then hiding away. And so I think that's maybe both of those things are meaningful to us, that one, in that time of crisis, they seek out one another. They don't just scatter and run to the wind. Here they go back. Maybe this is the same room where they had the Lord's Supper the night before. Maybe it's somewhere else. We don't know exactly. But they're hiding away. And they're staying. They want to stay together. They want to see each other and figure this out together. And I think we've, during this pandemic, that's been one of the hardest things, is that we can't all be together. We can't get together and talk it out with people we would usually find our support and sustenance from. And so instead, we are finding new ways to do that, and grateful for technology and Zoom and Google Meet and FaceTime and all these other things, and YouTube and Facebook, all these different ways that we can still get together even without being in the same room. But again, in this passage, we still see that they are afraid, and Jesus doesn't scold them for that. I think that's important to me, that when Jesus comes, he doesn't say, "What's wrong with you? Why would you be afraid?" He says, "Peace be with you." And peace be with you is, in some ways, that means do not be afraid, but it's not a scolding way, it's a reassuring way. And so that's Jesus' response to finding them there in fear, is to peace be with you, and then also I'm sending you. And so Jesus has something for them to do there.
Yeah, it's a pastoral response. We have this assurance that God is God. And the disciples would have had that, but at that moment they didn't need to hear some oratory on why God's power is supreme even in this moment. It's calm down, relax. It's okay. And I think that pastoral response is important, because as Baptists, we're believers in the priesthood of all believers. And so every one of us is able to give that pastoral response to one another. We can be that source of encouragement, assurance, calm, and the presence of Christ. We don't need to wait for somebody to come and show up and say, it's okay. And that's sort of the beauty. You mentioned the technology, but that's the beauty of this moment. There's so many ways for us to remain connected, to talk with one another. FaceTime and Zoom and GoToMeeting and all these different forms to see one another. So yeah, we can't get close, and we have to maintain our distance. I mean, it's so important to follow the CDC recommendations, but we can still minister to one another.
Yes, and that is exactly what Jesus tells them. He says, "As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And then says he breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." And so it's reassurance that he is with them, but then also, okay, I'm sending you, and I'm going to give you what you need to sustain you through this. And so I think that's an important lesson for us to remember too, that God is with us, God is sending us, and God will sustain us, and God will give us what we need to do that.
In John 20:19, if you'll go with me on just a very brief leap from first century Palestine to 21st century North America, the disciples, in a way, weren't doing it for the same reason, but they were practicing social isolation. They were in a room away from others, and they heard that familiar ping on their computers, and they hit the accept call button, and were able then to receive the encouragement from outside of their own source of isolation. Maybe an exegetical leap, but I think that this is where we are, a little bit sort of sequestered away, and having that assurance that we can still connect is amazing.
Yeah, and maybe one last little thing about this part, just to say that it did take them some time to figure it out, right? So they didn't just immediately, Jesus was crucified and resurrected, and now we go and do our thing.
Right.
They had to go and stop and stay in that room and make sense of all this. And so maybe that's just to say if we need a little time to figure out what to do with all this, it's okay to take a little time. We're not going to automatically jump to all the answers right away. Let me just say, for those that are watching and commenting, if you have things to add to this, questions you want to raise, or observations that you've made, or something significant, a connection of any kind, insignificant, significant, whatever, feel free to put those in there, and we will read them out and make those part of the conversation. So please.
Yeah, I've got one here. Do you have one to add?
No, go ahead.
Nell Tiller was just commenting on, and he breathed on them. And she said, I had never paid attention to those words there in this context, and really likes it. We have a greeting from the Philippines, and one from South Florida. But if you have something you'd like to add to this conversation, we would love to hear from you. Should we move to John 19? Do you want to?
Sure, I can read that one.
Okay.
Yeah, so John 19, 38 to 42. This is where Jesus is buried. It says, after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one because of his fear of the Jews, asked Pilate to let him take away the body of Jesus. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and removed his body. Nicodemus, who had at first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 pounds. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with the spices and linen cloths, according to the burial custom of the Jews. Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and in the garden there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And so, because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Okay. Now we're kind of going out of order and skipping around a bit, but that's all right. We're just thinking about all the different ways people respond to crisis, and we saw some going and hiding in fear, and perhaps they needed to. And then we have others. Here we have a couple of folks that are focused on the logistics. And maybe you've seen that in your life where something bad happens, or there's whatever kind of crisis it is. And people respond in different ways. And for many people, all right, what are we going to do right now? How are we going to fix this? What's our next step? What do we need to do? What are the action steps we need to take? And others that have said, you know what? Maybe I'm scared too, but this needs to get done. This needs to happen, and so I'm gonna do it. And so we have Joseph of Arimathea taking the body, and Nicodemus coming to help prepare it. And then we'll see on Easter morning the women coming to the tomb to do their part and helping to bring spices and make sure the body is prepared appropriately. There are a lot of people that are getting to work when the crisis comes.
It's always interesting to have a character come back into a story. And in John, we had Nicodemus back in John 3. He shows up again a little later, and then he comes in here. And it provides some narrative continuity, but it also shows us a little bit about the trajectory of spiritual formation. In John 3, Nicodemus really struggled with making sense of what Jesus was saying. After about, I think it was verse 12, it shifts to what really sounds like Jesus giving a speech or a sermon, and we don't really hear Nicodemus' response at that point. But seeing him here now, we can see that he's become a part of the life of Christ. And it reminds me a little bit of those who do I don't know, for lack of a better word, the grunt work of faith. It's one thing to get together and to sing the beautiful songs. Christ the Lord is risen today. We'll sing that in just a little bit. And this in here, in the sanctuary, feels like the work of the church. This feels like the spiritual work. The prayers, reading Scripture, studying the Bible, and it's all so important and really the centerpiece of our faith. But there's all that other stuff that is a part of being a body of believers. There's just thousands of volunteer hours in the life of the church. People who just selflessly give of their time, their talents. I mean, I think right now of Brian, who's doing a masterful job trying to keep Will and I in focus and keep us looking at the right camera, because sometimes we'll look at the wrong one and he'll point. You know, that's like removed from where we are right now, because nobody gets to see that work, that thankless task. And Nicodemus, along with Joseph of Arimathea, show up to do sort of that grunt work of faith.
Yes. We had a question pop up here on the YouTube comments from one Dean Tennant. And so he pointed us to Matthew 27:52, where it says, so this is right after Jesus dies, and the curtain split in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks were split. And it says, the tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. And so Dean pointed that out and said, did he raise other saints from the dead? What is happening here? So,
are you kicking that over to me?
I'll kick that one over to you to take that if you like.
I was really looking forward to hearing what you had to say.
That's a great point, Dean. That's a fascinating little verse there that we don't spend a lot of time talking about. We often talk about the temple, the curtain torn in two, and the symbolism of that. And then that other part just seems a little odd, that all these other bodies of the saints are raised.
In Matthew, there's this wider focus on fulfillment of prophecies. And so when we get into the way that the death is unfolding, Matthew is telling a story to a primarily Jewish audience to explain what has happened and why this is the fulfillment of God's promises. So often in Scripture, it says something that appears plain, like an action item. You know, this happened, then this happened, and this was the result. And it can feel like we should be able to visualize it like in a children's cartoon, you know, where it's just so concrete. And we go through the steps. One, the ground shook, tombs opened, and many were raised. And so we want to picture sort of this happening. But as is the case in our faith journey, it's sometimes harder to paint a concrete picture, shifting from a cartoon, an animated cartoon, to art in static images. The Baroque and Renaissance artists, the masters, did this amazing job, Caravaggio and others, Michelangelo, of painting beautiful pictures. And they're so lifelike, and the pictures, the colors are vibrant. But I don't know that they necessarily give us the best image of some stories. And I'm coming back to this passage. Abstract art sometimes does a better job of capturing what was going on, because we don't necessarily know. And what God was doing here was demonstrating power over death. That's the story of Easter. That's the story of the resurrection. It's Jesus' power, God's power over death. God incarnate, Jesus Christ, power over death. And so, was this to re-emphasize that point? Maybe. And given more time and to be able to do a little more research, we might be able to shed more light on this passage.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And I think part of what Matthew is doing there is just showing that in that moment when Christ dies, this is not just, oh, and then Jesus died. This is not just an ordinary event that happens. At that very moment, this is an earth-shattering event. And so the earth begins to quake. The temple curtain is torn. And perhaps what this is showing that victory over death, that Jesus' death, something else broke there, not just the temple curtain, not just the rocks on the ground, but
the veil between
life and death is breaking here
earth
too.
And heaven
that we have on Easter morning this hope of resurrection, and it is beginning even then, even in that moment. That
it's
something
in Isaiah, Zechariah, Amos, and I think Micah. There are all have images of earthquakes that bring life or signify God's action and movement. And so for Matthew to use that imagery, and I'm not saying there wasn't an actual earthquake, I'm saying that this conveys a deeper meaning.
Absolutely. So great question, Dean. Thank you for bringing that to us. We will perhaps pivot on to a little bit more of our discussion here, but I think that's a great insight to see. There are some odd parts of this story we don't always land on and talk about, but part of that is showing the mystery of this and how much this is broader than just one person on a cross. This is this cosmic event that has repercussions for everyone, living and dead.
Shall we shift to John 20, verses 11 through 18? I'll read those verses. Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they have laid him." When she said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her.
All right.
Weeping. Anyone who has ever lost someone dear will know those tears of grief. And to repress those tears is unhealthy, it's unnatural. I think of times in my life seeing people cry, and especially as a small child, and trying to make sense of it at a family funeral service when we lose a great aunt or a great grandparents, and especially my great grandparents when they passed, and we as a small child, it doesn't make as much sense because I had only known them as these distant elderly relatives, but seeing my grandparents and my parents and their grief, and that's formative because it teaches us how to grieve. And then in turn, having those waves of grief come over you when you've experienced loss. I know people who have had profound, incredible losses that no one should ever have to deal with, like losing a child, and how just overwhelming that. I cannot imagine how overwhelming that grief would be because I haven't experienced it. But I think that sense of grief can help us go to that place with Mary and sort of not know how she feels, because no one can ever know how another person feels truly. But we can imagine some sense of the grief. And so that weeping is a natural and appropriate response. And then to have this sort of jolting misplacement of the body. She showed up with certain expectations. This is sad, this is terrible. But, I mean, he did tell the religious leaders that if he stopped his followers, the stones would start to shout and sing. So they better just get over it. And so maybe for some of his followers, it's like, this is terrible, but it makes, sense. He had run afoul of the Romans, of the religious leaders. This is the natural step for Pax Romana. Well, now here she is, expecting to be able to treat his body, and then he's gone. And so this overwhelming sense of grief would have been just incredible.
Yeah, so I think this is another, exactly as you said, that showing that grieving and weeping is an important part of our response, and that it's important to do that, and that also Jesus comes to us there, and that God...
It doesn't end with
grieving.
No.
And even that paragraph that we just read begins with her weeping and ends with her going out and announcing to the disciples, I have seen the Lord,
right,
and telling them all those things. And so there is kind of this transformation that happens, and that as we move through grief, that is important to grieve, and it also doesn't come to define us. And so holding both of those things.
There's to give just a teaser for the worship service in just a little while, there is a constant theme in all of the Gospels of the Easter story, and it's a come and see and go and tell. Come and see, go and tell. Don't hold on to me, Mary. The end isn't death, the end is life.
Yeah. Well, in the interest of our time, I see we are getting closer and closer to an end point.
More?
Maybe we can just mention these perhaps, and then
sure.
open up to a little bit of more conversation here at the end and comments from folks. We put a couple other responses on here that we won't read through thoroughly right now, but we flipped over to Luke and saw the road to Emmaus. So this is where some of the disciples are walking along down the road, and they're talking to each other, trying to make sense of it, and this stranger comes along and they're talking to him about what happened, and as they go, eventually they realize that this was Jesus that was talking to them. But I just thought that was to add that into our mix as well, that talking about this crisis with others, trying to figure it out, what just happened back there? Even as they're walking on to the next place, they're still looking back and trying to make sense of what happened to them. And then eventually coming to this deeper understanding of Christ and encountering Christ in the midst of that, saying, oh, now I see better what has happened. Now I can make sense of it.
If you haven't read the Luke 24, verses 13 to 27 Emmaus passage in a while, or if you've never read it, take some time, maybe this afternoon, and read that. It's such an amazing response to Easter, and it's such a joy-filled response. Read it slowly, let it sink in, and think about yourself as one of those on that road and what that experience just might have been like. Well, let's talk about fishing.
And let's talk about fishing. Yeah, this one, I kind of enjoyed this as sort of a last one to put on there, that they go fishing. John 21, 1-3, we have 7 of the disciples up in the Sea of Galilee. So this is up in the north, so a good ways away from Jerusalem. They have left town, they've gone on, and many of these disciples had been fishermen. We remember that when they were called, when they dropped their nets and followed Jesus.
Are you going to do the Duke Ellington tune at this point? I'm going to go fishing?
I was not. But
okay, all right. Well, I thought that was a part of this when we were working on this, when Will put this outline together. I assumed we were going to have a beautiful rendition of...
But I do like that they are going fishing, and that they're going back to what they know in some ways. They're going on with life in a way. Where do I go from here? Well, I guess I'm going to go back home, going back to what I know, what I can do well. And I also think it's interesting that there are 7 of the disciples there. Usually we have all 12 disciples doing something, or just one going off, or 1 or 2 or 3. But here we've got 7 of the disciples that are going fishing, and that seems, I don't know whether to put too much importance on that or not, but perhaps that shows us that we don't all have to respond the same way to everything. That some of us may find different ways through a crisis or through the forks in the road of life, that we don't all have to choose one thing and that be our faithful response. That here, for 7 of these disciples, they decided to go fishing and they met Jesus there. Jesus came to them where they were. Others were doing other things.
What's interesting to me, in the Bible leaves enough of the sort of space between the lines for us to explore the passage and try to interject different ideas without detracting from the meaning. But as you were just describing the going on or going through the steps that seem natural or normal, I was even imagining, what if it was it was like Peter and Thomas who could see that Nathaniel really needed this. And so it was like Nathaniel wanted to wallow, and Peter said, Thomas, we got to get him out.
Yeah.
And it's like, it doesn't detract from the meaning to try to imagine some of these conversations, because like Will was just saying, we respond differently. There are 7 here. There are only 7 who've gone fishing. But what if of the 7, it was only 1 who just really needed that sort of tug to get to something familiar, to get back to life. And as we follow them, we once again find that calm assurance. Again, and we don't have a ton of time to get into what's next, but it's like Jesus is having a fish fry.
Yeah, and we don't know where the rest are. Maybe the 7 went to get food while the others are out preaching the gospel. Maybe the others went back home to see their families after all this had happened. They needed to
lick their wounds.
Yeah. Or who knows? We don't know. And so it's kind of actually interesting to sort of imagine that and think about those different responses and see that in whatever they're doing, Jesus is appearing to them and helping them continue on that journey. And we'll find all the disciples again in Acts, and they seem to be unified and back to of one accord there. But maybe for a while, the 7 needed to be over here, and the other 2 of them were there, and 3 were there. Who knows? But for the purposes of time, I want to just kind of wrap this up by putting it back to you all. We've thrown a few responses out there that we've seen in the disciples. Are there anything that sticks out to you as we've done this that you want to comment about, or other responses that we didn't mention that you'd like to add into the mix, or just anything else you'd like to share? I do see one comment here from Brad Groff saying that crisis brought them from secret and dark to actively working in the light. Crisis brought disciples to hiding for a time. Each has to work through it as they can.
Outside of both Facebook and YouTube, we did receive a text message that I want to share from Betty Barker, who said a special thanks to Brian. And I think that's appropriate, that as we're thinking about how we all are joining together, Alan Hendricks is here providing audio, and Brian Mulcahy is providing video. So.
Yes, and Brian, you got a good job from Amanda Ohms as well. So the praise is coming from all around, and we really are grateful.
And since he's controlling the cameras, he's not going to turn one to aim at himself. But continue to think about these stories. Continue to think about these responses. Continue to live this Easter story, because as we shift away from these biblical responses and to today, not just Easter Day, but to today, our world in a pandemic that stretches all over this entire planet, we can take this story of God's power over death, God's power over any circumstances, God's power over the darkness, and we can see it maybe as a sign of hope for the future. I really appreciate you joining us. I appreciate you being here. This has been a really neat experience for Will and I to be able to share together and to look at these different stories. And so I hope that you'll come back next week. We'll be going live again at 9:45, and we'll continue to look at biblical responses to a crisis. If you've got some suggestions, if there's something that you'd like to hear, reach out to us. You can send us a message through Facebook or through YouTube, or you can go to universitybaptist.org and you can click on the Contact Us page and reach out to us there directly. But we'd love to hear your ideas, and if you've got questions that you'd like us to work on, we would be happy to discuss those and address those in a future Sunday morning. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you'll come back and join us at 11 for worship. We've got a wonderful, very special worship service planned for you this morning.
Yes. Thank you all. Happy Easter, and we'll see you in a little while.
Joey, Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.